Hollow City by Ransom Riggs, Chapter 1. We rowed out through the harbor, past bobbing boats weeping rust from their seams, past juries of silent seabirds roosting atop the barnacled remains of sunken docks, past fishermen who lowered their nets to stare frozenly as we slipped by, uncertain whether we were real or imagined. A procession of waterborne ghosts, or ghosts soon to be. We were 10 children and 1 bird in 3 small and unsteady boats, rowing with quiet intensity straight out to sea. The only safe harbor for miles receding quickly behind us, craggy and magical in the blue-gold light of dawn. Our goal, the rutted coast of mainland Wales, was somewhere before us, but only dimly visible, an inky smudge squatting along the far horizon. We rowed past the old lighthouse, tranquil in the distance, which only last night had been the scene of so many traumas. It was there that, with bombs exploding around us, we had nearly drowned, nearly been torn apart by bullets, that I had taken a gun and pulled its trigger and killed a man, an act still incomprehensible to me, that we had lost Miss Peregrine and got her back again, snatched from the steel jaws of a submarine, though the Miss Peregrine who was returned to us was damaged, in need of help we didn't know how to give. She perched now on the stern of our boat, watching the sanctuary she'd created slip away, more lost with every oar stroke. Finally, we rowed past the breakwater and into the great blank open, and the glassy surface of the harbor gave way to little waves that chopped at the sides of our boats. I heard a plane threading through the clouds high above us, and let my oars drag, neck craning up, arrested by a vision of our little armada from such a height. This world I had chosen, and everything I had in it, and all our precious, peculiar lives contained in 3 splinters of wood, adrift upon the vast, unblinking eye of the sea. Mercy. Our boat slid easily through the waves, 3 abreast, a friendly current bearing us coastward. We rowed in shifts, taking turns at the oars to stave off exhaustion, though I felt so strong that for nearly an hour I refused to give them up. I lost myself in the rhythm of the strokes, my arms tracing long ellipses in the air, as if pulling something toward me that refused to come. Hugh manned the oars opposite me, and behind him, at the bow, sat Emma, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of a sun hat, head bent toward a map spread across her knees. Every so often, she'd look up from her map to consult the horizon, and just the sight of her face in the sun gave me energy I didn't know I had. I felt like I could row forever, until Horace shouted from one of the other boats to ask how much ocean was left between us and the mainland, and Emma squinted back toward the island and then down at her map, measuring with spread fingers, and said, somewhat doubtfully, 7 kilometers? But then Millard, who was also in our boat, muttered something in her ear, and she frowned, and turned the map sideways and frowned again, then said, I mean, 8.5. As the words left her mouth, I felt myself, and saw everyone else, wilt a little. 8.5 kilometers. A journey that would have taken an hour in the stomach-churning ferry that had brought me to Cairnholm weeks ago. A distance easily covered by an engine-powered boat of any size. 1.5 kilometers less than my out-of-shape uncles ran on odd weekends for charity. And only a few more than my mother boasted she could manage during rowing machine classes at her fancy gym. But the ferry between the island and the mainland wouldn't start running for another 30 years, and rowing machines weren't loaded down with passengers or luggage, nor did they require constant course corrections just to stay pointed in the right direction. Worse still, the ditch of water we were crossing was treacherous, a notorious ship swallower, 8.5 kilometers of moody, changeable sea, its floor fanned with greening wrecks and sailors' bones, and lurking somewhere in the fathoms-deep darkness, our enemies. Those of us who worried about such things assumed the whites were nearby, somewhere below us in that German submarine, waiting. If they didn't already know we'd fled the island, they'd find out soon enough. They hadn't gone to such lengths to kidnap Miss Peregrine, only to give up after one failed attempt. The warships that inched along like centipedes in the distance, and the British planes that kept watch overhead, made it too dangerous for the submarine to surface in broad daylight. But come nightfall, we'd be easy prey. They would come for us and take Miss Peregrine and sink the rest. So we rowed, our only hope that we could reach the mainland before nightfall reached us. We rowed until our arms ached and our shoulders knotted. We rowed until the breeze stilled and the sun blazed down as through a magnifying glass, and sweat pooled around our collars, and I realized no one had thought to bring fresh water, and that sunblock in 1940 meant standing in the shade. We rowed until the skin wore away from the ridges of our palms, and we were certain we absolutely couldn't row another stroke, but then did, and then another, and then another. "You're sweating buckets," Emma said. "Let me have a go at the oars before you melt away." Her voice startled me out of a daze. I nodded gratefully and let her switch into the oar seat. But 20 minutes later, I asked for it back again. I didn't like the thoughts that crept into my head while my body was at rest. Imagine scenes of my father waking to find me gone from our rooms on Cairnholm, Emma's baffling letter in my place, the panic that would ensue. Memory flashes of terrible things I'd witnessed recently, a monster pulling me into its jaws, my former psychiatrist falling to his death, a man buried in an icy coffin, torn momentarily from the next world to croak into my ear with half of a throat. So I rowed, despite my exhaustion and a spine that felt like I might never bend straight again, and hands rubbed raw from friction, and tried to think of exactly nothing, those leaden oars both a life sentence and a life raft. Bronwyn, seemingly inexhaustible, rowed one of the boats all by herself. Olive sat opposite, but was no help. The tiny girl couldn't pull the oars without pushing herself up into the air, where a stray gust of wind might send her flying away like a kite. So Olive shouted encouragement while Bronwyn did the work of 2, or 3 or 4, if you took into account all the suitcases and boxes weighing down their boat, stuffed with clothes and food and maps and books, and a lot of things less practical too, like several jars of pickled reptile hearts sloshing in Enoch's duffel bag, or the blown-off front doorknob to Miss Peregrine's house, a memento he had found in the grass on our way to the boats, and decided he couldn't live without. Or the bulky pillow Horace had rescued from the house's flaming shell. It was his lucky pillow, he said, and the only thing that kept his paralyzing nightmares at bay. Other items were so precious that the children clung to them even as they rowed. Fiona kept a pot of wormy garden dirt pressed between her knees. Millard had striped his face with a handful of bomb-pulverized brick dust, an odd gesture that seemed part mourning ritual. If what they kept and clung to seemed strange, part of me sympathized. It was all they had left of their home. Just because they knew it was lost didn't mean they knew how to let it go. After 3 hours of rowing like galley slaves, distance had shrunk the island to the size of an open hand. It looked nothing like the foreboding cliff-ringed fortress I had first laid eyes upon a few weeks ago. Now it seemed fragile, a shard of rock in danger of being washed away by the waves. "Look," Enoch shouted, standing up in the boat next to ours. "It's disappearing." A spectral fog enshrouded the island, blanking it from view, and we broke from rowing to watch it fade. "Say goodbye to our island," Emma said, standing and removing her big hat. "We may never see it again." "Farewell, island," said Hugh. "You were so good to us." Horace set down his oar and waved. "Goodbye, house. I shall miss all your rooms and gardens, but most of all, I shall miss my bed." "So long, Loop," Olive sniffled. "Thank you for keeping us safe all these years." "Good years," said Bronwyn. "The best I've known." I, too, said a silent goodbye to a place that had changed me forever, and the place that, more than any graveyard, would forever contain the memory and the mystery of my grandfather. They were linked inextricably, he and that island, and I wondered, now that they were both gone, if I would ever really understand what had happened to me, what I had was becoming. I had come to the island to solve my grandfather's mystery, and in doing so, I had discovered my own. Watching Cairnholm disappear felt like watching the only remaining key to that mystery sink beneath the dark waves. And then the island was simply gone, swallowed up by a mountain of fog, as if it had never existed. Before long, the fog caught up to us. By increments, we were blinded, the mainland dimming and the sun fading to a pale white bloom. And we turned circles in the eddying tide until we lost all sense of direction. Finally, we stopped and put our oars down and waited in the doldrummy quiet, hoping it would pass. There was no use going any further until it did. "I don't like this," Bronwyn said. "If we wait too long, it'll be night, and we'll have worse things to reckon with than bad weather." Then, as if the weather had heard Bronwyn and decided to put us in our place, it turned really bad. A strong wind blew up, and within moments our world was transformed. The sea around us whipped into white-capped waves that slapped at our hulls and broke into our boats, sloshing cold water around our feet. Next came rain, hard as little bullets on our skin. Soon we were being tossed around like rubber toys in a bathtub. "Turn into the waves," Bronwyn shouted, slicing at the water with her oars. "If they broadside us, we'll flip for sure." But most of us were too spent to row in calm water, let alone a boiling sea, and the rest were too scared even to reach for the oars. So instead, we grabbed for the gunwales and held on for dear life. A wall of water plowed straight toward us. We climbed the massive wave, our boats turning nearly vertical beneath us. Emma clung to me, and I clung to the oarlock. Behind us, Hugh held onto the seat with his arms. We crested the wave like a roller coaster, my stomach dropping into my legs. And as we raced down the far side, everything in our boat that wasn't nailed down, Emma's map, Hugh's bag, the red roller suitcase I lugged with me since Florida, went flying out over our heads and into the water. There was no time to worry about what had been lost, because initially we couldn't even see the other boats. When we'd resumed an even keel, we squinted into the maelstrom and screamed our friends' names. There was a terrible moment of silence before we heard voices call back to us, and Enoch's boat appeared out of the mist, all 4 passengers aboard, waving their arms at us. "Are you all right?" I shouted. "Over there," they called back. "Look over there." I saw that they weren't waving hello, but directing our attention to something in the water, some 30 yards away, the hull of an overturned boat. "That's Bronwyn and Olive's boat," Emma said. It was upside down, its rusty bottom to the sky. There was no sign of either girl around it. "We have to get closer," Hugh shouted, and forgetting our exhaustion, we grabbed the oars and paddled toward it, calling their names into the wind. We rode through a tide of clothes ejected from split-open suitcases, every swirling dress we passed resembling a drowning girl. My heart hammered in my chest, and though I was soaked and shivering, I hardly felt the cold. We met Enoch's boat at the overturned hull of Bronwyn's and searched the water together. "Where are they?" Horace moaned. "Oh, if we've lost them." "Underneath," Emma said, pointing at the hull. "Maybe they're trapped underneath it." I pulled one of my oars from its lock and banged it against the overturned hull. "If you're in there, swim out," I shouted. "We'll rescue you." For a terrible moment, there was no response, and I could feel any hope of recovering them slipping away. But then, from the underside of the overturned boat, there was a knock in reply, and then a fist smashed through the hull, wood chips flying, and we all jumped in surprise. "It's Bronwyn," Emma cried. "They're alive." With a few more strikes, Bronwyn was able to knock a person-sized hole in the hull. I extended my oar to her and she grabbed it, and with Hugh and Emma and me all pulling, we managed to drag her through the churning water and into our boat just as hers sank, vanishing beneath the waves. She was panicked, hysterical, shouting with breath she didn't have to spare, shouting for Olive, who hadn't been under the hull with her. She was still missing. "Olive. Got to get Olive," Bronwyn sputtered once she tumbled into the boat. She was shivering, coughing up seawater. She stood up in the pitching boat and pointed into the storm. "There," she cried. "See it?" I shielded my eyes from the singing rain and looked, but all I could see were waves and fog. "I don't see anything." "She's there," Bronwyn insisted. "The rope." Then I saw what she was pointing at. Not a flailing girl in the water, but a fat thread of woven hemp trailing up from it, barely visible in all the chaos. A strand of taut brown rope extended up from the water and disappeared into the fog. Olive must have been attached to the other end unseen. We paddled to the rope and Bronwyn reeled it down, and after a minute, Olive appeared from the fog above our heads. One end of the rope knotted around her waist. Her shoes had fallen off when her boat flipped, but Bronwyn had already tied Olive to the anchor line, the other end of which was resting on the sea floor. If not for that, she surely would have been lost in the clouds by now. Olive threw her arms around Bronwyn's neck and crowed, "You saved me! You saved me!" They embraced. The sight of them put a lump in my throat. "We ain't out of danger yet," said Bronwyn. "We still gotta reach shore before nightfall, or our troubles have only just begun." The storm had weakened some, and the sea's violent chop died down, but the idea of rowing another stroke, even in a perfectly calm sea, was unimaginable now. We hadn't even made it halfway to the mainland, and already I was hopelessly exhausted. My hands throbbed. My arms felt heavy as tree trunks. Not only that, but the endless diagonal rocking of the boat was having an undeniable effect on my stomach, and judging from the greenish color of the faces around me, I wasn't alone. "We'll rest a while," Emma said, trying to sound encouraging. "We'll rest and bail out our boats until the fog clears." "Fog like this has a mind of its own," said Enoch. "It can go days without breaking. It'll be dark in a few hours, and then we'll have to hope we can last until morning without the whites finding us. We'll be utterly defenseless." "And without water," said Hugh. "Or food," added Millard. Olive raised both hands in the air and said, "I know where it is." "Where what is?" said Emma. "Land. I saw it when I was up at the end of that rope." Olive had risen above the fog, she explained, and briefly caught a clear view of the mainland. "Fat lot of good that does," grumbled Enoch. "We've circled back on ourselves a half-dozen times since you were dangling up there." "Then let me up again." "Are you certain?" Emma asked her. "It's dangerous. What if a wind catches you or the rope snaps?" Olive's face went steely. "Reel me up," she repeated. "When she gets like this, there's no arguing," said Emma. "Fetch the rope, Bronwyn." "You're the bravest little girl I ever knew," Bronwyn said, then set to working. She pulled the anchor out of the water and up into our boat, and with the extra length of rope it gave us, we lashed together our 2 remaining boats so they couldn't be separated again, then reeled Olive back up through the fog and into the sky. There was an odd quiet moment when we were all staring at a rope in the clouds, heads thrown back, waiting for a sign from heaven. Enoch broke the silence. "Well?" he called, impatient. "I can see it," came the reply, Olive's voice barely a squeak over the white noise of waves. "Straight ahead." "Good enough for me," Bronwyn said, and while the rest of us clutched our stomachs and slumped uselessly in our seats, she clambered into the lead boat and took the oars and began to row, guided only by Olive's tiny voice, an unseen angel in the sky. Left. More left. No, not that much. And like that, we slowly made our way toward land, the fog pursuing us always, its long gray tendrils like the ghostly fingers of some phantom hand, ever trying to draw us back. As if the island couldn't quite let us go either. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Our twin hulls ground to a halt in the rocky shallows. We hove up onto shore just as the sun was dimming behind acres of gray clouds, perhaps an hour left until full dark. The beach was a stony spit clogged with low-tide sea wrack, but it was beautiful to me, more beautiful than any champagne white tourist beach back home. It meant we had made it. What it meant to the others, I could hardly imagine. Most of them hadn't been off Cairnholm in a lifetime, and now they gazed around in wonder, bewildered to still be alive, and wondering what on earth to do about it. We staggered from our boats with legs made of rubber. Fiona scooped a handful of slimy pebbles into her mouth and rolled them over her tongue, as if she needed all 5 senses to convince herself she wasn't dreaming. Which was just how I'd felt about being in Miss Peregrine's loop at first. I had never in all my life so distrusted my own eyes. Bronwyn groaned and sank to the ground, exhausted beyond words. She was surrounded and fussed over and showered with thanks for all she had done. But it was awkward. Our debt was too great, and the words thank you too small. And she tried to wave us away, but was so tired she could barely raise her hand. Meanwhile, Emma and the boys reeled Olive down from the clouds. "You're positively blue," Emma exclaimed when Olive appeared through the fog, and she leapt up to pull the little girl into her arms. Olive was soaked and frozen, her teeth chattering. There were no blankets, nor even a stitch of dry clothing to give her. So Emma ran her ever-hot hands around Olive's body until the worst of her shudders subsided, then sent Fiona and Horace away to gather driftwood for a fire. While waiting for their return, we gathered around the boats to take stock of all we'd lost at sea. It was a grim tally. Nearly everything we'd brought now littered the seafloor. What we had left were the clothes on our backs, a small amount of food in rusty tins, and Bronwyn's tank-sized steamer trunk, indestructible and apparently unsinkable, and so absurdly heavy that only Bronwyn herself could ever hope to carry it. We tore open its metal latches, eager to find something useful, or better yet, edible. But all it held was a 3-volume collection of stories called Tales of the Peculiar, the pages spongy with seawater, and a fancy bath mat embroidered with the letters A.L.P., Miss Peregrine's initials. "Oh, thank heavens, someone remembered the bath mat," Enoch deadpanned. "We're saved." Everything else was gone, including both our maps, the small one Emma had used to navigate us across the channel, and the massive leather-bound loop atlas that had been Millard's prized possession, the Map of Days. When Millard realized it was gone, he began to hyperventilate. That was one of only 5 extant copies, he moaned. It was of incalculable value. Not to mention, it contained years of my personal notes and annotations. At least we still have the Tales of the Peculiar, said Claire, wringing seawater from her blonde curls. I can't get to sleep at night without hearing one. What good are fairy tales if we can't even find our way? Millard asked. I wondered. Find our way to where? It occurred to me that in our rush to escape the island, I had only ever heard the children talk about reaching the mainland. But we'd never discussed what to do once we got there. As if the idea of actually surviving the journey in those tiny boats was so far-fetched, so comically optimistic, that planning for it was a waste of time. I looked to Emma for reassurance, as I often did. She gazed darkly down the beach. The stony sand backed up to low dunes swaying with sawgrass. Beyond was forest, an impenetrable-looking barrier of green that continued in both directions as far as I could see. Emma, with her now-lost map, had been aiming for a certain port town, but after the storm hit, just making it to dry land had become our goal. There was no telling how far we'd stray off course. There were no roads I could see, or signposts, or even footpaths. Only wilderness. Of course, we didn't really need a map or a signpost or anything else. We needed Miss Peregrine, a whole healed one. The Miss Peregrine who would know just where to go and how to get us there safely. The one perched before us now, fanning her feathers dry on a boulder, was as broken as her maimed wing, which hooked downward in an alarming V. I could tell it pained the children to see her like this. She was supposed to be their mother, their protector. She'd been queen of their little island world, but now she couldn't speak, couldn't loop time, couldn't even fly. They saw her and winced and looked away. Miss Peregrine kept her eyes trained on the slate-gray sea. They were hard and black and contained unutterable sorrow. They seemed to say, I failed you. Horace and Fiona arced toward us through the rocky sand, the wind poofing Fiona's wild hair like a storm cloud. Horace bouncing with his hands pressed against the sides of his top hat to keep it secure on its head. Somehow he had kept hold of it throughout our near disaster at sea, but now it was a stove in on one side like a bent muffler pipe. Still, he refused to let it go. It was the only thing, he said, that matched his muddy, sopping, finely tailored suit. Their arms were empty. There's no wood anywhere, Horace said as they reached us. Did you look in the woods? Emma said, pointing at the dark line of trees behind the dunes. Too scary, Horace replied. We heard an owl. Since when are you afraid of birds? Horace shrugged and looked at the sand. Then Fiona elbowed him, and he seemed to remember himself and said, We found something else, though. Shelter? Asked Emma. A road? Asked Millard. A goose to cook for supper? Asked Claire. No, Horace replied. Balloons. There was a brief, puzzled silence. What do you mean, balloons? Emma said. Big ones, in the sky, with men inside. Emma's face darkened. Show us. We followed them back the way they'd come, curving around a bend in the beach and climbing a small embankment. I wondered how we could possibly have missed something as obvious as hot air balloons, until we crested a hill and I saw them. Not the big, colorful teardrop-shaped things you see in wall calendars and motivational posters. The sky's the limit, but a pair of miniature zeppelins, black, egg-shaped sacks of gas with skeletal cages hung below them, each containing a single pilot. The craft were small and flew low, banking back and forth in lazy zigzags, and the noise of the surf had covered the subtle whine of their propellers. Emma herded us into the tall sawgrass, and we dropped down out of sight. "They're submarine hunters," Enoch said, answering the question before anyone had asked it. Millard might have been the authority when it came to maps and books, but Enoch was an expert in all things military. "The best way to spot enemy subs is from the sky," he explained. "Then why are they flying so close to the ground?" I asked. "And why aren't they further out to sea?" "That I don't know." "Do you think they could be looking for us?" Horace ventured. "If you mean could they be whites," said Hugh, "don't be daft. The whites are with the Germans. They're on that German sub." "The whites are allied with whomever it suits their interests to be allied with," Millard said. "There's no reason to think they haven't infiltrated organizations on both sides of the war." I couldn't take my eyes off the strange contraptions in the sky. They looked unnatural, like mechanical insects bloated with tumorous eggs. "I don't like the way they're flying," Enoch said, calculating behind his sharp eyes. "They're searching the coastline, not the sea." "Searching for what?" asked Bronwyn. But the answer was obvious and frightening, and no one wanted to say it aloud. They were searching for us. We were all squeezed together in the grass, and I felt Emma's body tense next to mine. "Run when I say run," she hissed. "We'll hide the boats, then ourselves." We waited for the balloons to zag away, then tumbled out of the grass, praying we were too far away to be spotted. As we ran, I found myself wishing that the fog which had plagued us at sea would return again to hide us. It occurred to me that it had very likely saved us once already. Without the fog, those balloons would have spotted us hours ago in our boats, when we had nowhere to run. And in that way, it was one last thing that the island had done to save its peculiar children. We dragged our boats across the beach toward a sea cave, its entrance a black fissure in a hill of rocks. Bronwyn had spent her strength completely and could hardly manage to carry herself, much less the boats, so the rest of us struggled to pick up the slack, groaning and straining against hulls that kept trying to bury their noses in the wet sand. Halfway across the beach, Miss Peregrine let out a warning cry, and the two zeppelins bobbed up over the dunes and into our line of sight. We broke into an adrenaline-fueled sprint, flying those boats into the cave like they were on rails, while Miss Peregrine hopped lamely along beside us, her broken wing dragging in the sand. When we were finally out of sight, we dropped the boats and flopped onto their overturned keels, our wheezing breaths echoing in the damp and dripping dark. "Please, please let them not have seen us," Emma prayed aloud. "Ah, birds, our tracks," Millard yelped, and then he stripped off the overcoat he'd been wearing and scrambled back outside to cover the drag marks our boats had made. From the sky, they looked like arrows, pointing right to our hiding place. We could only watch his footsteps trail away. If anyone but Millard had ventured out, they'd have been seen for sure. A minute later he came back, shivering, caked in sand, a red stain outlining his chest. "They're getting close now," he panted. "I did the best I could." "You're bleeding again," Bronwyn fretted. Millard had been grazed by a bullet during our melee at the lighthouse the previous night, and though his recovery so far was remarkable, it was far from complete. "What have you done with your wound dressing?" "I threw it away. It was tied in such a complicated manner that I couldn't remove it quickly. An invisible must always be able to disrobe in an instant, or his power is useless. He's even more useless dead, you stubborn mule, said Emma. Now hold still and don't bite your tongue. This is going to hurt. She squeezed 2 fingers in the palm of her opposite hand, concentrating for a moment. When she took them out again, they glowed red hot. Millard balked. Now, Emma, I'd rather you didn't. Emma pressed her fingers to his wounded shoulder. Millard gasped. There was the sound of singeing meat, and a curl of smoke rose up from his skin. In a moment, the bleeding stopped. I'll have a scar, Millard whined. Yes, and who'll see it? He sulked and said nothing. The balloon's engines grew louder, then louder still, amplified by the cave's stone walls. I pictured them hovering above the cave, studying our footprints, preparing their assault. Emma leaned her shoulder into mine. The little ones ran to Bronwyn and buried their faces in her lap, and she hugged them. Despite our peculiar powers, we felt utterly useless, powerless. It was all we could do to sit hunched and blinking at one another in the pale half-light, noses running from the cold, hoping our enemies would pass us by. Finally, the engine's whine began to dwindle, and when we could hear our own voices again, Claire mumbled into Bronwyn's lap. Tell us a story, Wyn. I'm scared, and I don't like this at all, and I think I'd like to hear a story instead. Yes, would you tell one? Olive pleaded. A story from the tales, please. They're my favorite. The most maternal of the peculiars, Bronwyn was more like a mother to the young ones than even Miss Peregrine. It was Bronwyn who tucked them into bed at night. Bronwyn who read them stories and kissed their foreheads. Her strong arms seemed made to gather them in warm embraces, her broad shoulders to carry them. But this was no time for stories, and she said as much. Why, certainly it is, Enoch said, with sing-songy sarcasm. But skip the tales for once and tell us the story of how Miss Peregrine's wards found their way to safety without a map or any food and weren't eaten by Hollowgast along the way. I'm ever so keen to hear how that story ends. If only Miss Peregrine could tell us, Claire sniffled. She disentangled herself from Bronwyn and went to the bird, who'd been watching us from her perch on one of the boat's overturned keels. What are we to do, headmistress? Said Claire. Please turn human again. Please wake up. Miss Peregrine cooed and stroked Claire's hair with her wing. Then Olive joined us, her face streaking with tears. We need you, Miss Peregrine. We're lost and in danger and increasingly peckish, and we've got no home anymore, nor any friends but one another, and we need you. Miss Peregrine's black eyes shimmered. She turned away, unreachable. Bronwyn knelt down beside the girls. She can't turn back right now, sweetheart, but we'll get her fixed up, I promise. But how? Olive demanded. Her question reflected off the stone walls, each echo asking it again. Emma stood up. I'll tell you how, she said, and all eyes went to her. We'll walk. She said it with such conviction that I got a chill. We'll walk and walk until we come to a town. What if there's no town for 50 kilometers? Said Enoch. Then we'll walk for 51 kilometers. But I know we weren't blown that far off course. And if the whites should spot us from the air? Said Hugh. They won't. We'll be careful. And if they're waiting for us in the town? Said Horace. We'll pretend to be normal. We'll pass. I was never much good at that, Millard said with a laugh. You won't be seen at all, Mill. You'll be our advance scout, and our secret procurer of necessary items. I am quite a talented thief, he said, with a touch of pride. A veritable master of the 5-fingered arts. And then, Enoch muttered sourly, maybe we'll have food in our bellies and a warm place to sleep, but we'll still be out in the open, exposed, vulnerable, loopless. And Miss Peregrine is still... We'll find a loop somehow, said Emma. There are landmarks and signposts for those who know what to look for. And if there aren't, we'll find someone like us, a fellow peculiar who can show us where the nearest loop is. And in that loop, there will be an imbrine, and that imbrine will be able to give Miss Peregrine the help she needs. I'd never met anyone with Emma's brash confidence. Everything about her exuded it. The way she carried herself, with shoulders thrown back. The hard set of her teeth when she made up her mind about something. The way she ended every sentence with a declarative period, never a question mark. It was infectious, and I loved it. And I had to fight a sudden urge to kiss her right there in front of everyone. Hugh coughed, and bees tumbled out of his mouth to form a question mark that shivered in the air. How can you be so bloody sure? He asked. Because I am, that's all. And she brushed her hands as if that were that. You make a nice, rousing speech, said Millard. And I hate to spoil it, but for all we know, Miss Peregrine is the only imbrine left uncaptured. Recall what Miss Avocet told us. The Whites have been raiding loops and abducting imbrines for weeks now, which means that even if we could find a loop, there'd be no way of knowing whether it still had its imbrine, or was occupied instead by our enemies. We can't simply go knocking on loop doors and hoping they aren't full of Whites. Or surrounded by half-starved hollows, Enoch said. We won't have to hope, Emma said, then smiled in my direction. Jacob will tell us. My entire body went cold. Me? You can sense hollows from a distance, can't you? Said Emma, in addition to seeing them. When they're close, it kind of feels like I'm going to be sick, I admitted. How close do they have to be? Asked Millard. If it's only a few meters, that still puts us within devouring range. We need you to sense them from much farther away. I haven't exactly tested it, I said. This is all so new to me. I'd only ever been exposed to Dr. Golan's hollow, Malthus, the creature who'd killed my grandfather, then nearly drowned me in Cairnholm's bog. How far away had he been when I'd first felt him stalking me, lurking outside my house in Englewood? It was impossible to know. Regardless, your talent can be developed, said Millard. Peculiarities are a bit like muscles. The more you exercise them, the bigger they grow. This is madness, Enoch said. Are you all really so desperate that you'd stake everything on him? Why, he's just a boy, a soft-bellied normal who knows next to nothing of our world. He isn't normal, Emma said, grimacing as if this were the direst insult. He's one of us. Stuff and rubbish, yelled Enoch. Just because there's a dash of peculiar blood in his veins doesn't make him my brother. And it certainly doesn't make him my protector. We don't know what he's capable of. He probably wouldn't know the difference between a hollow at 50 meters and gas pains. He killed one of them, didn't he? Said Bronwyn. Stabbed it through the eyes with a pair of sheep shears. When's the last time you heard of a peculiar so young doing anything like that? Not since Abe, Hugh said. And at the mention of his name, a reverent hush fell over the children. I heard he once killed one with its bare hands, said Bronwyn. I heard he killed one with a knitting needle and a length of twine, said Horace. In fact, I dreamed it, so I'm certain he did. Half of those stories are just tall tales, and they get taller with every year that passes, said Enoch. The Abraham Portman I knew never did a single thing to help us. He was a great peculiar, said Bronwyn. He fought bravely and killed scores of hollows for our cause. And then he ran off and left us to hide in that house, like refugees, while he gallivanted across America playing hero. You don't know what you're talking about, Emma said, flushing with anger. There was a lot more to it than that. Enoch shrugged. Anyway, that's all besides the point, he said. Whatever you thought of Abe, this boy isn't him. In that moment, I hated Enoch. And yet, I couldn't blame him for his doubts about me. How could the others, so sure and seasoned in their abilities, put so much faith in mine, in something I was only beginning to understand, and had known I was capable of for only a few days? Whose grandson I was seemed irrelevant. I simply didn't know what I was doing. You're right. I'm not my grandfather, I said. I'm just a kid from Florida. I probably got lucky when I killed that hollow. Nonsense, said Emma. You'll be every bit the hollow slayer Abe was one day. One day soon, let's hope, said Hugh. It's your destiny, said Horace. And the way he said it made me think he knew something I didn't. And even if it ain't, said Hugh, clapping his hand on my back, you're all we've got, mate. If that's true, Bird help us all, said Enoch. My head was spinning. The weight of their expectations threatened to crush me. I stood unsteady and moved toward the cave exit. I need some air, I said, pushing past Enoch. Jacob, wait, cried Emma. The balloons. But they were long gone. Let him go, Enoch grumbled. If we're lucky, he'll swim back to America. Walking down to the water's edge, I tried to picture myself the way my new friends saw me, or wanted to. Not as Jacob, the kid who once broke his ankle running after an ice cream truck, or who reluctantly, and at the behest of his dad, tried and failed 3 times to get onto his school's non-competitive track team. But as Jacob, inspector of shadows, miraculous interpreter of squirmy gut feelings, seer and slayer of real and actual monsters, and all that might stand between life and death for our merry band of peculiars. How could I ever live up to my grandfather's legacy? I climbed a stack of rocks at the water's edge and stood there, hoping the steady breeze would dry my damp clothes. And in the dying light, I watched the sea, a canvas of shifting grays, melded and darkening. In the distance, a light glinted every so often. It was Cairnholm's lighthouse, flashing its hello and last goodbye. My mind drifted. I lapsed into a waking dream. I see a man. He's of middle age, cloaked in excremental mud, crabbing slowly along the knife tip of a cliff. His thin hair uncombed and hanging wet across his face. Wind whips his thin jacket like a sail. He stops, drops to his elbows, slips them into divots he'd made weeks before, when he was scouting these caves for mating turns and shearwaters' nests. He raises a pair of binoculars to his eyes, but aims them low, below the nests, at a thin crescent of beach, where the swelling tide collects things and heaves them up. Driftwood and seaweed, shards of smashed boats, and sometimes, the locals say, bodies. The man is my father. He's looking for something that he desperately does not want to find. He is looking for the body of his son. I felt a touch on my shoe and opened my eyes, startled out of my half-dream. It was nearly dark, and I was sitting on the rocks with my knees drawn into my chest. And suddenly, there was Emma, breeze tossing her hair, standing on the sand below me. "How are you?" she asked. It was a question that would have required some college-level math and about an hour of discussion to answer. I felt 100 conflicting things, the great bulk of which canceled out to equal cold and tired and not particularly interested in talking. So I said, "I'm fine, just trying to dry off," and flapped the front of my soggy sweater to demonstrate. "I can help you with that." She clambered up the stack of rocks and sat next to me. "Give me an arm." I offered one up, and Emma laid it across her knees. Cupping her hands over her mouth, she bent her head toward my wrist. Then, taking a deep breath, she exhaled slowly through her palms, and an incredible soothing heat bloomed along my forearm, just on the edge of painful. "Is it too much?" she said. I tensed, a shudder going through me, and shook my head. "Good." She moved farther up my arm to exhale again. Another pulse of sweet warmth. Between breaths, she said, "I hope you're not letting what Enoch said bother you. The rest of us believe in you, Jacob. Enoch can be a wrinkle-hearted old titmouse, especially when he's feeling jealous." "I think he's right," I said. "You don't really, do you?" It all came pouring out. "I have no idea what I'm doing," I said. "How can any of you depend on me? If I'm really peculiar, then it's just a little bit, I think. Like I'm a quarter peculiar, and the rest of you guys are full-blooded." "It doesn't work that way," she said, laughing. "But my grandfather was more peculiar than me. He had to be. He was so strong." "No, Jacob," she said, narrowing her eyes at me. "It's astounding. In so many ways, you're just like him. You're different too, of course. You're gentler and sweeter. But everything you're saying, you sound like Abe when he first came to stay with us." "I do?" "Yeah. He was confused too. He'd never met another peculiar. He didn't understand his power or how it worked or what he was capable of. Neither did we, to tell the truth. It's very rare what you can do. Very rare. But your grandfather learned." "How?" I asked. "Where?" "In the war. He was part of a secret, all-peculiar cell of the British Army. Fought Holocaust and Germans at the same time. The sorts of things they did you don't win medals for. But they were heroes to us, and none more than your grandfather. The sacrifices they made set the corrupted back decades and saved the lives of countless peculiars. And yet, I thought, he couldn't save his own parents. How strangely tragic." "And I can tell you this," Emma went on. "You're every bit as peculiar as he was. And as brave, too." "Ha, now you're just trying to make me feel better." "No," she said, looking me in the eye. "I'm not. You'll learn, Jacob. One day, you'll be an even greater Hollow Slayer than he was." "Yeah, that's what everyone keeps saying. How can you be so sure?" "It's something I feel very deeply," she said. "You're supposed to, I think. Just like you were supposed to come to Cairnholm." "I don't believe in stuff like that. Fate, the stars, destiny." "I didn't say destiny." "Supposed to is the same thing," I said. "Destiny is for people in books about magical swords. It's a lot of crap. I'm here because my grandfather mumbled something about your island in the 10 seconds before he died, and that's it. It was an accident. I'm glad he did, but he was delirious. He could just as easily have rattled off a grocery list." "But he didn't," she said. I sighed, exasperated. "And if we go off in search of loops, and you depend on me to save you from monsters, and instead I get you all killed, is that destiny too?" She frowned, put my arm back in my lap. I didn't say destiny, she said again. What I believe is that when it comes to big things in life, there are no accidents. Everything happens for a reason. You're here for a reason, and it's not to fail and die. I didn't have the heart to keep arguing. Okay, I said. I don't think you're right, but I do hope you are. I felt bad for snapping at her before, but I'd been cold and scared and feeling defensive. I had good moments and bad, terrified thoughts and confident ones, though my terror to confidence ratio was pretty dismal at present, like 3-1. And in the terrified moments, it felt like I was being pushed into a role I hadn't asked for. Volunteered for frontline duty in a war, the full scope of which none of us yet knew. Destiny sounded like an obligation, and if I was to be thrust into battle against a legion of nightmare creatures, that had to be my choice. Though in a sense, the choice had been made already, when I agreed to sail into the unknown with these peculiar children. And it wasn't true if I really searched the dusty corners of myself, that I hadn't asked for this. Really, I'd been dreaming of such adventures since I was small. Back then, I'd believed in destiny, and believed in it absolutely, with every strand and fiber of my little kid heart. I'd felt it like an itch in my chest while listening to my grandfather's extraordinary stories. One day, that will be me. What felt like an obligation now had been a promise back then, that one day I would escape my little town and live in an extraordinary life, as he had done, and that one day, like Grandpa Portman, I would do something that mattered. He used to say to me, "You're going to be a great man, Jacob, a very great man." "Like you?" I would ask him. "Better," he'd reply. I believed him then, and I still wanted to. But the more I learned about him, the longer his shadow became, and the more impossible it seemed that I could ever matter the way he had. That maybe it would be suicidal even to try. And when I imagined myself trying, thoughts of my father crept in, my poor, about-to-be devastated father, and before I could push them out of my mind, I wondered how a great man could do something so terrible to someone who loved him. I began to shiver. "You're cold," Emma said. "Let me finish what I started." She picked up my other arm and kissed with her breath the whole length of it. It was almost more than I could handle. When she reached my shoulder, instead of placing the arm in my lap, she hung it around her neck. I lifted my other arm to join it, and she put her arms around me too, and our foreheads nodded together. Speaking very quietly, Emma said, "I hope you don't regret the choice you made. I'm so glad you're here with us. I don't know what I'd do if you left. I fear I wouldn't be all right at all." I thought about going back. For a moment, I really tried to play it out in my head, how it would be if I could somehow row one of our boats back to the island again and go back home. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't imagine. I whispered, "How could I?" "When Miss Peregrine turns human again, she'll be able to send you back, if you want to go." My question hadn't been about logistics. I had meant simply, how could I leave you? But those words were unsayable, couldn't find their way past my lips. So I held them inside, and instead I kissed her. This time, it was Emma whose breath caught short. Her hands rose to my cheeks, but stopped just shy of making contact. Heat radiated from them in waves. "Touch me," I said. "I don't want to burn you," she said. But a sudden shower of sparks inside my chest said, "I don't care." So I took her fingers and raked them along my cheek, and both of us gasped. It was hot, but I didn't pull away. Dared not, for fear she'd stop touching me. And then our lips met again, and we were kissing again, and her extraordinary warmth surged through me. My eyes fell closed. The world faded away. If my body was cold in the night mist, I didn't feel it. If the sea roared in my ears, I didn't hear it. If the rock I sat on was sharp and jagged, I hardly noticed. Everything outside the two of us was a distraction. And then, a great crash echoed in the dark. But I thought nothing of it. Could not take myself away from Emma. Until the sound doubled and was joined by an awful shriek of metal, and a blinding light swept over us. And finally I couldn't shut it out any more. The lighthouse, I thought. The lighthouse is falling into the sea. But the lighthouse was a pinpoint in the distance, not a sun-bright flash, and its light only traveled in one direction, not back and forth, searching. It wasn't a lighthouse at all. It was a searchlight, and it was coming closer, from the water to the shore. It was the searchlight of a submarine. Brief seconds of terror in which brain and legs were disconnected. My eyes and ears registered the submarine not far from shore. Metal beast rising from the sea. Water rushing from its sides. Men bursting onto its deck from open hatches, shouting, training cannons of light at us. And then the stimulus reached my legs and we slid, fell, and pitched ourselves down from the rocks and ran like hell. The spotlight threw our pistoning shadows across the beach, 10 feet tall and freakish. Bullets pocked the sand and buzzed the air. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Stop! Do not run!" We burst into the cave. "They're coming! They're here! Get up! Get up!" But the children had heard the commotion and were already on their feet. All but Bronwyn, who had so exhausted herself at sea that she had fallen asleep against the cave wall and couldn't be roused. We shook her and shouted in her face, but she only moaned and brushed us away with a sweep of her arm. Finally, we had to hoist her up by the waist, which was like lifting a tower of bricks. But once her feet touched the ground, her red-rimmed eyelids split open and she took her own weight. We grabbed up our things, thankful now that they were so small and so few. Emma scooped Miss Peregrine into her arms. We tore outside. As we ran into the dunes, I saw behind us a gang of silhouetted men splashing the last few feet to shore. In their hands, held above their heads to keep them dry, were guns. We sprinted through a stand of wind-blown trees and into the trackless forest. Darkness enveloped us. What moon wasn't already hidden behind clouds was blotted out now by trees, branches filtering its pale light to nil. There was no time for our eyes to adjust, or to feel our way carefully, or to do anything other than run in a gasping, stumbling herd with arms outstretched, dodging trunks that seemed to coalesce suddenly in the air just inches from us. After a few minutes, we stopped, chests heaving, to listen. The voices were still behind us, only now they were joined by another sound. Dogs barking. We ran on. End of chapter 2.